My name is Steve Rook. I'm the chair of MANUP. As you'll notice, Dan's in a hospital bed at the moment, so he may sort of dip in and dip out. This evening we're kind of really excited because we've invited Dr. Susie Bennett, to give her a correct title, Susie, to you and I, along to give us a talk. She's just completed a PhD a little while back, focusing on men, particularly young men, and suicide, and that's what she's got her PhD in. But I think further on from that, she's extending this research, and MANUP is funding that, so that she can continue to kind of write this paper. And the reason that that's really important is because she's doing this from the heart. And it's something that she's absolutely passionate about, and that's one of the reasons that we've got her speaking tonight. And in the vain hope that you know, the findings and the paper and everything will start to change or turn heads in the NHS, and also kind of, you know, in the way that we socialize about it and the way that we talk about it. But you haven't come here to listen to me, so I'm just going to hand over to Susie. She will she'll talk and present for probably sort of 40 minutes or so, and then we're hoping to have sort of like quite a good Q&A at the end of it. So Susie, all yours. I'm muting.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Steve. And hopefully you can all see my screen now. And well, first of all, I just want to say thank you all for being here. And like Steve says, it is something I'm very passionate about, this question of why do men die by suicide. It's a question I've been thinking about for a long time, but I've started studying it in a research context since 2018. And suicide's a very complicated behavior. If we think of sort of the spectrum of behaviors that humans do, if we think of sort of at the lower end, things like making a cup of tea or eating a sandwich, very sort of few factors go into doing that kind of behavior. And suicide sits right at the other end of the spectrum in terms of the complexity of the factors that are involved in the decision to not want to, or to feel like you can't be here anymore. And it's also, of course, an unbelievably emotional topic. I'm emotional about it every day, and I know that many of you here are also deeply emotional about it and may have very emotional reasons for being here, whether you've lost a man to suicide, whether there's a man in your life that you're worried about, whether you're worried about yourself. So what I want to try and do this evening is to give you an insight into some of the key findings that we've established so far from our research in terms of this question, why do men die by suicide? And I also want to try and give you some tools to help you in your thinking about suicide, so that you can try and navigate your way through the sort of complexity and emotions of this topic with a bit more clarity. So I'm going to share with you some of the tools that have helped me in my thinking. So in 1861, that's the year that suicide statistics started being recorded in the UK. And so since 1861, every single year up until the latest statistics that we've had for this quarter, 2024, every single year we've seen higher deaths in men than in women. And in the last year that we've got complete figures for, 75% of suicides deaths were male. So there's clearly this gender dimension to deaths by suicide, where men are at elevated risk, and we've known that since 1861. Despite knowing that for hundreds of years, there hasn't been the research outputs to really understand why men are at such risk. And for me, it kind of feels like this question of gender is sort of the elephant in the room of suicide research. Very few researchers have asked specifically, what is it about being a man? What is it about the male experience that elevates suicide risk for men? So as such, there are still really big gaps in our understanding. The first thing to say is that suicide is incredibly complicated, and I wish that I could distill kind of very simple explanations and answers, because I know a lot of people, that's what they're seeking, especially in relation to people they may have lost or people that they were worried about. But there's no one size fits all answer. In my research and speaking to men, they're not a uniform group of people. There's huge diversity in men and in male behavior. And I've just shared some examples up here. So I remember one study where a man was described as aggressive and macho, and another man was described as the community's moral support. And both men went on to die by suicide. So those are descriptions of very different men doing the same behavior. I've spoken to many men who are absolutely desperate for help. They really want help, but they can't afford it. And I've spoken to men who also think that getting help is weak. I've spoken to men who appear visibly excluded. They have very few people in their life. And I've spoken to men who have lots of people, lots of relationships around them, but they still feel emotionally alone. I've spoken to bereaved families where a suicide is described as happening out of the blue. They didn't have any sense that somebody was in any kind of distress. And I've spoken to families where they've lost a man to suicide and there have been challenges for many years. I've seen evidence of men who describe their attempts as very impulsive. So they thought about suicide just a few minutes before making an attempt, and other men who plan their suicide for years. And I've spoken to men who've made a suicide attempt and then said they've never felt suicidal again. Having survived their attempt, they just didn't feel that kind of pain again. And I've spoken to men who've made an attempt and they've implemented tools and they've got strategies to sort of manage their suicidal pain, but it's still something that they live with to this day. So these are just a few examples to just show you the range of behaviors that sort of fall under this umbrella of men who can feel suicidal. And even though suicide is very complicated, we've often in research studied it as if it were a problem that existed just in the body and the brain of the individual. So that's where the problem resided, in the individual person. Was actually there's many factors that can contribute to somebody's suicidal pain. There's biological factors like your hormones and physical health conditions, our upbringings, our home environments, the communities we grew up in, our school experiences, whether we were bullied, whether we made friends, our education abilities, our relationship and social support, our romantic relationships, divorce, parental alienation, and then life stresses such as losing your job or unemployment, housing problems, accidents, cultural attitudes that might discriminate against aspects of our identity, as well as social, political, and economic factors. All these factors and more contribute to the pain that somebody can feel. So this image here is what I'm sharing because it's something that's helped me make sense of the complexity of suicide. And that is that every suicide is like an orchestra producing an individual symphony of sorrow, and every human life carries its own melody. And we don't look at the orchestra and go, it's this violin player in the fifth row that produces the sound. We understand that the sound is made by all those different instruments in interaction. And the same is true of suicide. Every person's suicide or suicide attempt is a symphony of individual sorrow produced by many different risk factors in interaction with one another. And every suicidal person is an individual with a unique biology and a unique lived experience. So suicide researchers like myself can never tell you the notes that every violin player in the fifth row of an orchestra is playing. But what we can do is sort of zoom out a layer and begin to explore the sort of general rhythm and melody of different sections of the orchestra. And that's what I'm going to try to share with you in this session. Just what are some of the general rhythms and melodies of suicidal pain that we've identified? And not all these findings will be true for every man, but hopefully we can start to build up a sense of some of the sounds we should be listening out to it for. I'm going to share very briefly just some key ideas from the theories of suicide, because I find these very helpful for just giving some tools to start helping us think about suicide and what can cause suicide. So different theories of suicide emphasize different kind of psychological factors as important to a suicidal crisis. There's things like feeling like a failure, feeling trapped, feeling lonely, feeling like a burden. So that different theories emphasize different things, but what they almost all have in common in terms of the psychological theories of suicide is this idea of psychological pain, that people who die by suicide are in so much psychological pain they can't bear to be alive. And this quote I find very powerful from a man called Edwin Schneidman, who's a very significant suicide researcher. And he says, the author of suicide is pain. So what do we mean when we're talking about psychological pain? Well, really, it's an umbrella term for different unpleasant emotions. So things like loneliness and despair or jealousy, shame, fear. Everybody's sort of got their own cocktail of psychological pain. But what these different feelings and emotions have in common is that they're unlike feelings like joy or happiness, which are nice to feel. These psychologically painful feelings are painful to feel. We don't want to feel them. And when we are feeling them, we want to find a way to avoid them or escape them or transform them. So this next diagram is something I put together, which has really helped me enormously in just trying to visualize this relationship between psychological pain and suicide risk. So I'd like everybody to sort of imagine that each of us carries inside of us our own tank of psychological pain. And if we imagine at the top of that tank is an exposure tap that's pouring pain into our tank, and each single one of us is going to face different experiences and different challenges in our life that are going to pour pain into our exposure pipe. And then if we imagine at the bottom of our tank, we've got a regulation pipe that can help carry some of that pain out of our tank. And there are lots of different ways we can regulate pain and cope with distressing thoughts. We can go to therapy. Some people may use medication. We can leave bad relationships or bad jobs. We can talk to friends or partners. All these tools can potentially help us take pain out of our tank. But there are also pain regulation strategies that can sometimes be unhealthy or dangerous, like binge eating or drugs or self-harm. These sort of regulation strategies can potentially give us short-term relief from our pain, but what they often end up doing is just putting pain back into our tanks. So the tools that we have to regulate our pain can impact whether our pain gets bigger or our pain gets smaller. And then lastly, if we imagine a sort of threshold line near the top of our tank, and this line indicates how much pain we can bear. So if we experience high exposure to pain and we've got poor regulation of that pain, and that pain in our tank is just building and building and getting fuller and fuller, there's going to be a point where we reach a threshold of how much pain we can endure. And when we start hitting that threshold, that's when we may start to be thinking about suicide as a way to escape our pain. So when I'm thinking about suicide risk, it helps me to consider these kind of 3 dimensions of psychological pain in interaction. So the first thing I'm thinking about is how much psychological pain has a person been exposed to? And this pain can be both active, present in our lives now, and historical pain. So you might, for example, have an argument with your partner this evening that's causing you pain in this moment, but this argument may also trigger memories from your childhood and your parents and historical pain from 40 years ago. So that's the first question, thinking about how much pain has a person been exposed to or is exposed to. Then secondly, what tools does a person have to regulate that pain? And do those tools make the pain bigger or smaller in the long run? And what are the signs to be looking out for to indicate that that pain is reaching its threshold? And that's going to be individual for every single one of us. What starts to happen for us when we're reaching our sort of cliff edge? So for example, for me, I listen to music all of the time. Every day I'm listening to music, but when my mental health starts descending, I stop listening to music. And that's a real flag for me that I'm starting to reach, a place where I don't want to reach. So that also, the third important question is, what are those indications of when that pain may be getting too much? And then the last thing just to discuss before we start looking why men specifically might be at risk is just quickly to look at what these theories of suicide have to tell us about what might be causing this pain. So what is potentially driving this pain? And like I say, different theories emphasize different factors as driving this pain. They can be roughly grouped into 3 different areas of life. So some theories think it's about pain in relation to our emotions. So certain theories say a suicidal crisis is partly about you're just overwhelmed by your feelings and you don't know how to regulate them. And these are often feelings of feeling defeated, of feeling trapped, of feeling hopeless. Other theories talk about this pain, this psychological pain being about painful thoughts and feelings that we have about ourselves. So feeling like a failure or feeling like a burden or feeling unlovable. And then the last area that certain theories emphasize is pain in relation to our connections with others. So pain in relation to feeling deeply lonely or disconnected or like we don't belong. So we're going to start thinking now about why men might be at particular risk, but I want to keep in mind this sort of tank of psychological pain and this idea of exposure, regulation, and threshold, and then these 3 potential sources of pain in terms of emotions, how we think and feel about ourselves, and relationships with others. And I'm going to share with you some findings that we did from a big study where we basically looked at 20 years of research into male suicides. We found 78 studies, and these were qualitative studies. So they were interviews with men who've been suicidal or are suicidal and people bereaved by male suicide. And these 78 studies came from 18 different countries, and there were over 1,695 people encapsulated in these studies. And what we did is that we took these 78 studies and we looked for the common patterns across these studies, looking for common risk factors and common recovery factors. And in terms of risk factors, we were looking at both distant risk factors, so factors that were sort of in the background and over the long term that seemed to increase men's pain, and then factors that were more immediate, so factors that seemed to be directly associated to a suicide attempt or a suicide death. And what we found is in 96% of papers, we found evidence of a potential link between cultural norms of masculinity and male suicide risk. So what do I mean when I say cultural norms of masculinity? Well, there are both broadly speaking, there are both biological and cultural differences between men and women, or sex and gender differences. So biological and sex differences are differences in our body, in our hormones. And my work doesn't look at that, but it is potentially a very critical part of the puzzle as to why men might be at elevated risk. Instead, in this study, we're looking at cultural factors. So these gendered ideas that cultures and societies and communities and that we all hold about these expectations for how men and women should behave. And I'm looking at how these ideas may impact people. So if you think of cultural norms of masculinity like this unwritten rule book that we all sort of inherit about what it means to be a man. So these sort of expectations around what emotions men can express, what men should be ambitious for, what sort of jobs they do, what makes a man valuable. And these ideas and expectations can shape men's sense of themselves and shape how they interact with the world. And they also, really importantly, shape all the rest of us. So I, as a woman, have also been shaped by these expectations and ideas of how men should behave. And that influences how I interact with men. Now, just a couple of quick disclaimers before we go into these findings. First of all, I want to make clear that norms of masculinity, and masculinity, when I'm talking about it, I'm not talking about fixed traits that are true for all men. And some men may really reject certain cultural norms, whereas other men may feel a really strong pressure to live up to them. So cultural norms do not in any way define men. And the other thing that I really want to emphasize is that these findings refer to external societal expectations for men to behave in certain ways, which we think may harm some men's well-being. These findings do not in any way imply that there's something internal to men, something inside of men that is inherently sort of broken or dysfunction. And I also want to say that there are many norms of masculinity that have made tremendously meaningful and beautiful contributions to human life and to society. However, our findings do suggest that there are certain norms that may, for some men, elevate their suicide risk. And these norms had to do with three specific areas, which should be familiar to us now after looking at those theories of suicide. And so these first set of norms were around men suppressing their emotions and the impact this then had on men's relationship with their feelings. And then second of all, norms of male success and feelings of failure, and how that seems to impact some men's relationship with how they think and feel about themselves as individual men. And then lastly, norms that deny and diminish men's relationship needs and the impact that this has on men's relationships with other people. And what we found is that the harms done by these norms of masculinity on these three areas of men's life seem to increase their psychological pain and their suicide risk. So I'm just going to share with you now some of the key findings from within each of these sort of themes. So starting with relationship and the relationship with emotions. So the first sort of sub-theme we found here was around emotional suppression and dysregulation. So these cultural norms for men to deny certain emotions, to be strong, to be independent, to cope with their problems, seem to impact both men's internal relationship with their emotions, so their own ability to sort of identify and understand what they're feeling, as well as that external expression of their emotions. So limiting the permission some men felt to express what they're feeling. Some men felt a pressure to conceal their pain from other people. They felt it was their job to be strong, to protect others from their pain. Some said they had nobody they trusted to talk to. And what this emotional suppression seemed to mean was that these feelings were kept inside. And as difficult things in life kind of built up and built up, these emotions were sort of trapped inside and became increasingly sort of overwhelming and difficult to bear. And this I find such a moving quote from one of the studies. This is a 36-year-old man from Australia who'd attempted suicide. And he said, with my closest friends, it was, I don't want you to know how I feel. I'm a dad of 3 kids and a husband. I've got a good job. I don't want you to know that I'm so sad that I cry at red lights. And I remember speaking once to a man who'd made an attempt on his life. And I remember him saying to me that genuinely in the lead up to his attempt, it seemed better to him to kill himself than to tell his wife how he was feeling. And when you sit with an idea like that and you hear someone say that out loud, you start to realize the level of violence that these kind of cultural ideas are enacting on certain men. The second sub-theme was around painful events in childhood, which seemed to impact some men's emotional development. And we saw lots of different challenging experience referenced here. So from sort of bullying to abuse to neglect, being abandoned. And then some men grew up with this sense that the world was not safe from a young age. They lacked this sense of safety, and they learned to cope with that with self-harming, with using drugs, or for some men, by thinking about suicide from a young age. And this quote from a 71-year-old gay man in Canada who experienced child abuse, he said, I would wish very much that I was dead, even at an age when I'm not sure a kid understands what death is. And we know that there's a lot of evidence for the impact of childhood adversity and suicide risk. And that adversity, some kids come from beautifully, wonderfully loving homes, and that adversity lives outside of the home. And for some people, it can live inside of the home. But the thing that I think is really important when we're thinking about this in relation to men is this double whammy that men may experience of these boys who potentially experience real pain in childhood and then are socialized in these masculine norms to deny that pain. So how does that pain ever then find release? And so when we think about sort of painful events in childhood and these norms of emotional suppression, then the men and boys who experience adversity in childhood may be left particularly isolated. The third sub-theme we saw was around men feeling like it was weak to get support and to get help. But we did actually see more evidence of other men who did go and get help, but had really negative experiences because the services were super busy and they're focused on short-term quick fixes like medication. Some men said that if they expressed their distress very calmly or in a matter-of-fact way, then professionals would sometimes underestimate the severity of their feeling and they weren't treated as though they were in crisis, even though they were. And then lastly, we saw this evidence of men developing their own short-term strategies to cope with their pain. And this included things like drinking, fighting, gambling, self-harm, sex. And men would describe these behaviors as pain relief, of helping them escape their feelings and turn off their brains. But what these feelings often did is cause longer term damage and compound the pain over the long term. And then lastly, in our study, the most common explanation for suicide was as a way to escape unbearable psychological pain. So in terms of immediate risk, this was the biggest finding we found. And this quote from a 60-year-old unemployed gay man from Canada who described his suicide as a pain-ending strategy. And he said, the worst pain is you just don't think it will ever stop. So the second area that we're going to look at is how these norms of masculinity can impact men's relationship with themselves. So in over half the studies, men seem to have very strong ideas about what it means to be a successful man. And they had this feeling that they were failing in areas of life where society expected men to do well. And these feelings of failure, were a source of real shame and self-loathing for them. And then some men described basically then pretending to be fine, pretending to the outside world that they were okay, that they were happy and everything's going well, whilst there's this sort of internal experience of struggling and being full of pain. And men spoke about how exhausting it was basically to feel like they were pretending all of the time and how frightening it could be to feel this sort of gap open up between how you were presenting to the outside world and how you're actually feeling on the inside. And then we saw evidence of these challenges in childhood impacting men's self-esteem. So men having this feeling from childhood that they were abnormal in some way, or that they didn't belong, and how the sort of legacy of these early life experiences seem to impact men's self-esteem into their adult lives. And then in just under half the studies, men describe their suicide as a drive to kill a failed self. So these men seem to feel and experience defeats in life as totally condemning of them as individual men, and that these failures meant that they had lost all sort of worth and value to other people. And then a smaller minority of men describe their suicide as a way of regaining control. So in life, they felt like they'd lost control over their existences, and suicide was in some way a way in which that they could get that control back by ending the pain. And this quote from a Brazilian man describes his suicide attempt as such: I tried to set up a business for myself and my family, and it didn't work. I lost money, and there was no other alternative except killing myself. And then the last area that we're going to look at is how masculine norms seem to impact how some men build relationships with other people. So these norms of kind of emotional suppression and independence seem to keep some men emotionally separate and isolated from others. And many men felt deeply alone with their pain. Men also described relationship challenges as a source of stress, and that they struggled to build and sustain intimate relationships with other people. They struggled to trust other people. This quote from a woman who lost her boyfriend to suicide said, "He was afraid to let people get too close to him. I believe that was a survival mechanism. He's had so many tough experiences through his life. He learned very early to just shut off sharply." And then in terms of immediate risk, we saw evidence of a relationship breakdown or some kind of relationship conflict in the lead up to a suicide attempt or death. Other men described overwhelming feelings of loneliness and isolation as drivers of suicide, and a smaller minority of men described feeling like a burden. And this quote from a Canadian man aged 40 to 49 years, he said, "I'm not adding to anybody else's life. I can go for months and years without talking to family members. So, you know, if I'm here or if I'm not here, what difference does it make?" So I want to talk now about some of the things that can help. What has some of the research shown about how men might manage their suicidal despair and move forward with their lives? Now, the first thing to say is that research has often focused much more on risk factors than it has on recovery. So we still lack good evidence about what is effective in helping men specifically, because what works for women doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for men. And what works for one man doesn't mean that it's going to be helpful for all men. In the conversations I've had with men, I've seen a huge diversity in terms of the way that different men want to cope with their challenges. I've spoken to men who've had terrible experiences on medication, some men that have found it really helpful, some men that have had terrible experiences with talking therapy, some men that credit it with saving their lives. I've had lots and lots of conversations with men about the importance of peer support. Then men who found support from family and friends, other men that find it through solitude, through self-management. So they want tools to be able to learn to manage their crises privately. Men who cope using nature, through reading, music, learning, watching YouTube talks, listening to podcasts, or through sports and volunteering activity. There's a whole diverse sort of toolbox that men can use to cope with their pain. And each sort of individual man is a journey for themselves about finding what works for them. But very broadly, from our evidence, from our research, we see that tools and interventions that help men basically repair these areas of their life that we've spoken about as sort of risk areas can help them reduce their pain and reduce their suicide risk. So tools that help men to reconnect with and regulate their emotions, tools that help men to build a more compassionate and forgiving sense of themselves, and tools and opportunities for men to build meaningful relationships with other people. So in terms of emotional regulation and control, for some men that comes through therapy and having the opportunity to sort of acknowledge and talk about their problems, understand the triggers for their distress, and explore as well how experiences in the past have sort of shaped the pain that they feel today. As I say, lots of men have spoken to me about the power of peer support, and it seems to have multiple sort of transformative components. Just the power of speaking to other men that have struggled just normalizes those struggles, normalizes those feelings of failure. It broadens ideas of masculinity. It helps build hope to see other men who've been to very dark places and have sort of reclaim their lives, and helps to create very powerful connections. Then interventions that can help those meaningful connections for men. So a lot of times significant others are on the front line of a suicidal crisis. So interventions that can help significant others sort of cope with that crisis as well, and support the men they may be worried about as well. And then interventions that can strengthen and support these community connections. And then lastly, something that we can all do is challenge some of these corrosive ideas. And I believe we need much richer representations of masculinities in our societies and cultures. We need to value and celebrate men as emotional beings. We need to value and celebrate men as relational beings with a universal need for meaningful connection and intimate relationships. We need to normalize male vulnerability and healthy coping mechanisms. And we need to both challenge harmful masculine norms and practices, but we also have to make sure that we celebrate the valuable and beautiful and essential contributions that men make to our societies. And like I say, norms of masculinity is something that we are all socialized in. And for me, it's been so important in this work for me to look inwards and examine my own gender biases. And this is a theory that I find so powerful from two psychologists called Seeger and Barry. And it's this idea of gamma bias and this hypothesis that cultural norms may condition our empathy and cause us to look at men and their behavior with certain biases. And those biases may mean that we're more likely to see men as causing harm than being harmed. And we're more likely to see men as privileged than seeing men as disadvantaged. And the last quote I'm going to share with you is a quote that, I mean, I've heard thousands of stories now, and so many things have moved me, but this quote in particular just haunted me so deeply. So we did a survey, and we asked as part of the survey, what are some of the other factors that contribute to your suicidal thoughts and feelings? And this man who's 29, he thinks about suicide every 3 days and has had thoughts of suicide since he was 13. This is what he said. He said, the ever-increasing feeling of hopelessness as I age, and less people giving a shit now that I'm a grown man. At what age does society decide that a boy worthy of love, care, and protection is now a man and no longer deserving of any? And I have to say that quote haunts me. I find it so powerful and so moving. And I think that it's so important for all of us to sort of excavate those ideas of men that we're holding that may in some way starve men of compassion that is essential for us in resolving the male suicide crisis. And I want to finish with just some seeds of hope, because I know this is very heavy for us to think about. And there are some incredibly brilliant and beautiful people in this space trying to help. First of all, I just want to share that this was I went to the dentist the other day, and these were the posters up in the bathroom. And I found this so moving. So you have a poster here for Refuge, which is a domestic violence charity for women and children, and then a poster for Mankind, which is a domestic abuse charity for men. So not only is it signposting for the people that need it, where they can go, but it's also showing every single person that goes into that room that men are also potential victims of domestic abuse. There's some amazing organizations out there working on this issue. James's Place is a crisis center for men who are suicidal that started in Liverpool, and they have like I say, it's a crisis center just for men. They have an intervention that's tailored just for men. There's an organization called Sean's Place that is also a community organization just for men. There's the Lighthouse charity for people in construction for mental health, and construction has the biggest male suicide death rates of all the industries. There's a military mental health football club, a cold water swimming football club, these peer support community groups. And then, of course, I have to personally say a massive, massive thank you to MANUP, because I started doing this research in 2018, and this year's been the first year that I haven't had to do additional external work to try and get the income to sustain my life so I could do it, because of the funding that MANUP have given me. So I want to say a massive thank you to them, and just signpost you to a couple of other places. We've got a website called malesuicideresearch.com, where we've developed public guides of our research, so you can go there to get more information. And there's also an Instagram page where I'm trying to share more tools to help us in our thinking about suicide. So that's it from me for now, and thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Susie. I mean, you know, I know what it's all about, but because we've spoken at length in the past, and obviously, you know, about that funding and so on. But so I, you know, as MANUP, we probably know more about it than you're kind of giving away now in a kind of a brief 45-minute presentation there. But just stunning. And I had a look through the people that have responded, and we've got some good, great, and very influential people in there, which is absolutely fantastic. And I really hope that this kind of resonates with people. And I think, you know, there's a lot of messages that have come through on the chat that people are just loving it. Do people have okay, so let's start with the question here. Sorry, this is